The story of women prisoners of war in Soviet labor camps during and after World War II remains one of the least documented chapters of that global conflict. While the fate of male POWs has been extensively studied, the experiences of women who fell into Soviet captivity have remained largely in shadow, their testimonies scattered, their numbers disputed, their suffering minimized or overlooked entirely. Yet their stories demand to be told, not only as a matter of historical record, but as a testament to human endurance in the face of almost unimaginable hardship. When we think of World War II prisoners of war, our minds typically conjure images of Allied airmen in German stalags or emaciated soldiers liberated from Japanese camps. The Geneva Conventions, even imperfectly applied, provided some framework for the treatment of military prisoners in Western theaters of war. But on the Eastern Front, where Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union engaged in a war of annihilation that claimed more than 25 million Soviet lives, the rules of warfare collapsed entirely. The Soviets had not signed the 1929 Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war, and Nazi ideology regarded Slavic peoples as subhuman, undeserving of basic human rights. In this cauldron of mutual hatred and ideological extremism, prisoners on both sides faced conditions that defied description. The women who ended up in Soviet captivity came from various backgrounds and circumstances. Some were German military auxiliaries, the Helferinnen, who served in communications, anti-aircraft batteries, and administrative roles. Others were nurses and medical personnel, captured when field hospitals were overrun. There were women from Hungary, Romania, and other Axis nations who had been serving in various capacities when Soviet forces swept through their countries. Some were civilians caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, accused of collaboration, or simply swept up in the chaos of advancing Soviet armies. A smaller number were actual combatants, women who had taken up arms in the desperate final defense of Berlin or other cities. The journey to the camps often began in the immediate aftermath of capture, in scenes of confusion and terror. As Soviet forces advanced westward in the final years of the war, they moved with a speed and fury that left little time for organized surrender. Women found themselves rounded up alongside men, herded into makeshift collection points, stripped of any valuables, and subjected to initial interrogations that could range from perfunctory to brutal. The Soviet system made little distinction between military personnel and civilians, between those who had actively participated in the war effort and those who simply had the misfortune of being in occupied territory when liberation came. From these collection points, the women were loaded onto freight trains for journeys that could last weeks or even months. These were not passenger cars, but cattle cars, wooden wagons designed to transport livestock, now packed with human cargo. 50, 60, sometimes 70 women might be crammed into a single car with only a small opening for ventilation. There were no seats, no sanitary facilities beyond a hole cut in the floor, no protection from the elements. In summer, the cars became suffocating ovens. In winter, they were frigid boxes where women huddled together for warmth, their breath creating a fog of moisture that froze on the walls. The trains moved slowly eastward, stopping frequently at sidings to allow military transports priority on the rails. At these stops, the doors might be opened briefly to allow prisoners to relieve themselves beside the tracks or to receive their daily ration, typically a ladleful of thin soup and a chunk of black bread. Water was scarce and often contaminated. Dysentery swept through the cars, and with nowhere to properly clean themselves, the women existed in conditions of almost unimaginable filth. The elderly and the weak began to die, their bodies sometimes remaining in the cars for days before they could be removed at a station and buried in unmarked graves beside the tracks. One survivor, a German nurse named Margarita Buber-Neumann, later wrote of her transport. "We were no longer human beings with individual faces and personalities. We had become a mass, a collective burden to be moved from one point to another with the minimum of fuss and expense. The dead were merely an inconvenience, the living barely more than that. The destinations of these transports were the labor camps of the Gulag system, that vast archipelago of prisons and forced labor colonies that stretched across the Soviet Union from the Arctic Circle to the deserts of Kazakhstan. The term Gulag itself is an acronym for Glavnoye Upravlение Исправительно-Trudovых лагерей, the main administration of corrective labor camps. This bureaucratic mouthful concealed a system that, at its peak, held millions of prisoners working in conditions that ranged from merely harsh to absolutely lethal. For women prisoners of war, certain camps became particularly notorious. Potma in Mordovia, Vorkuta in the Arctic, Magadan in the Far East, and numerous smaller camps scattered across Siberia and Central Asia all held populations of foreign women alongside Soviet political prisoners and common criminals. The camps varied in size from a few hundred prisoners to several thousand, but they shared certain characteristics: isolation, brutal climate, inadequate food, and work that pushed human endurance to its limits. The first sight of the camp was often shocking even to women who had already endured weeks of transport. Surrounded by high wooden fences topped with barbed wire, watched over by towers where guards stood with machine guns and searchlights, the camps were designed to eliminate any hope of escape. The vast distances of the Soviet interior provided a secondary barrier. Even if one somehow got through the fences, there was nowhere to go. In Siberia, the forest or the tundra would kill an escapee long before they reached any settlement. Inside the gates, the women were processed through a system designed to strip away the last vestiges of their former identities. They were photographed, their personal details recorded in ledgers, their remaining possessions confiscated. They were issued camp clothing, typically whatever worn-out garments were available, a padded jacket and pants for winter, lighter cotton for summer. These clothes were rarely adequate for the climate and almost never the right size. Tall women received clothes too small, short women swam in oversized garments. The universal footwear was valenki, traditional Russian felt boots, or, in summer, simple canvas shoes that fell apart within weeks. The barracks where the women would live were long wooden structures with minimal insulation, heated if they were lucky by a single stove in the center. Bunks lined the walls, 2 or 3 tiers high, each shared by 2 women who slept head to foot to maximize space. A single thin blanket and a straw mattress were the only comforts. In winter, despite the stove, the temperature inside the barracks might drop below freezing. Women slept in their clothes, huddled together for warmth, waking with frost on their blankets. The daily routine in the camps was designed around one principle: extracting the maximum amount of labor from the prisoners while providing the minimum necessary to keep them alive and working. The day began before dawn with a wake-up call, often the harsh ringing of a bell or the shouts of guards. The women had perhaps 30 minutes to use the latrine, a structure that itself was an ordeal, an outhouse with holes over a pit, offering no privacy and often frozen solid in winter. They would wash at a communal pump or basin with icy water, if water was available at all. Breakfast, such as it was, consisted of more black bread and perhaps some hot water with a vague flavor of grain that passed for tea or coffee. Then came the morning count. The prisoners lined up in the cold while guards verified numbers, a process that could take an hour or more if there were any discrepancies. Only then would the work brigades form up and march out to their labor assignments. The work varied depending on the camp's primary function. Some camps focused on logging, sending women into the forests with axes and saws to fell trees, strip branches, and haul the timber to collection points. This was back-breaking work made infinitely worse by the cold, where sweat from exertion would freeze against the skin and metal tools could stick to bare flesh. The production quotas were set impossibly high, calculated for healthy men working under normal conditions, not starving women in Arctic temperatures.
Failure to meet the quota meant a reduction in food rations, creating a vicious cycle where weakening prisoners could work less, received less food, and weakened further.
Other camps operated mines where women descended into the earth to extract coal, copper, gold, or other minerals. The mines were dark, dangerous places where cave-ins, gas explosions, and flooding were constant threats. Women worked in tunnels barely high enough to stand in, breathing air thick with dust, their lungs slowly destroyed by silicosis. Without proper safety equipment, injuries were common and often fatal. A broken leg or crushed hand in the mine meant being unable to work, and those who could not work did not receive full rations. The camp authorities made brutal calculations about whether keeping an injured prisoner alive was worth the expense. In some camps, particularly those in more southern regions, women worked in agriculture, planting and harvesting crops on vast collective farms. While this might seem less harsh than mining or logging, it came with its own miseries. Women worked bent over in fields from sunrise to sunset, planting potatoes or wheat by hand, harvesting with primitive tools. In summer, the sun beat down mercilessly and mosquitoes swarmed in clouds. In spring and autumn, they worked ankle-deep in mud. The irony was not lost on the prisoners that they were producing food they would never taste, growing grain that would be made into bread far better than the moldy chunks they received. Construction work claimed other brigades of women, building railroads, roads, and new camps. They hauled rocks, mixed concrete with shovels, dug foundations in ground that was frozen solid for much of the year. The work was endless because there was always another project, another quota to fulfill, another plan handed down from Moscow demanding that production increase regardless of the human cost. The camp authorities enforced a system where food rations were tied directly to work output. Those who exceeded their quota received Category A rations, which might include a small amount of meat or fat along with bread and soup. Those who met their quota received Category B. Those who failed to meet quota were placed on Category C, a starvation ration that made it nearly impossible to recover strength and return to productive work. This system created a desperate competitiveness among prisoners, where solidarity could mean survival, but everyone faced the temptation to look out for themselves first. Yet, despite the camp system's attempts to reduce prisoners to mere labor units, the women found ways to maintain their humanity. They formed small groups, often based on shared language or nationality, that became quasi-families. They shared extra bits of food when they had them, looked out for the sick, and tried to protect the most vulnerable. These bonds were essential to survival, providing emotional support that was as necessary as bread and water. Some women found ways to trade and barter within the informal camp economy. A woman who worked in the kitchen might smuggle out a potato to trade for a needle and thread. Someone assigned to the clothing depot might find an extra pair of socks to exchange for a few grams of tobacco. The camp authorities officially forbid such trading, but they also tacitly recognized that this underground economy helped keep prisoners alive and working without requiring additional resources from the state. Religious faith sustained many women through their ordeal. Secret prayer groups formed, meeting in corners of barracks after the guards had finished their evening rounds. Women who had been nurses or teachers before the war shared what they remembered, educating others, keeping minds active even as bodies deteriorated. On Christmas or Easter, women would save tiny portions of their rations to create a meager feast, a symbolic assertion that they remained human beings with culture and tradition, not just labor units. The medical care in the camps ranged from inadequate to non-existent. Most camps had a medical station of sorts, staffed by a Soviet doctor or occasionally by a prisoner with medical training, but supplies were extremely limited. There were no antibiotics in the early years, no proper surgical facilities, no medication for the numerous diseases that swept through the camps. The doctors did what they could with hot water, bandages, and sometimes folk remedies, but many conditions were simply untreatable. Dysentery, tuberculosis, and pneumonia were constant killers. Scurvy from vitamin deficiency caused teeth to fall out and wounds to fail to heal.
Frostbite in winter meant amputated fingers and toes, operations performed without anesthesia. Women suffered from amenorrhea, the cessation of menstruation caused by malnutrition and stress. While this meant one less burden to deal with in the camp's primitive conditions, it was also a sign of bodies shutting down, sacrificing reproductive function to maintain basic survival. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical hardships. Women watched friends die, saw strong individuals break under the strain, and lived with the constant uncertainty about their own fate. Letters from home were rare and often arrived months or years late, if at all. Many women had no idea whether their families were alive or dead, whether their children were being cared for, whether anyone even knew where they were. Depression was endemic, a grayness of spirit that matched the gray landscape. Some women simply gave up, refusing to eat, lying down, and willing themselves to die. The other prisoners had a name for this state. They called it going to the wall, because such women would sit with their backs against the barracks wall and wait for death. Others maintained hope through sheer stubbornness, through anger at their captors, through determination to survive just one more day. The years passed with an agonizing slowness. The Soviet Union officially announced the end of the war in May of 1945, but for the women in the camps, nothing changed. While soldiers elsewhere were going home to parades and reunions, the women prisoners of war remained in Siberia, in the Arctic, in Kazakhstan. The Soviet government made no immediate plans to repatriate them. They were still needed as labor, still serving sentences for crimes real or imagined, still hostages to the tensions of the emerging Cold War. It was not until 1949 and 1950 that significant numbers of women began to be released and repatriated, and even then the process was slow and arbitrary. Some women who had been captured in 1945 were still in camps in 1953 when Stalin died. A few would not see freedom until 1956 or even later. The exact numbers remain disputed to this day. Soviet records were incomplete or deliberately falsified. German records were destroyed in the war. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of women passed through the Soviet camp system as prisoners of war, but firm numbers are impossible to establish. For those who did survive and return home, the ordeal was not over. In Germany, which was now divided, returning prisoners found a country in ruins, their families scattered or dead, their former lives impossible to reclaim. Many faced suspicion and stigma. In the atmosphere of the Cold War, anyone who had spent years in the Soviet Union was potentially a communist agent. Former prisoners of war, particularly women, were often treated as embarrassments, their stories too uncomfortable to hear, their suffering too complex to acknowledge. Some survivors found that their families had given them up for dead and moved on. Husbands had remarried. Children barely remembered mothers who had been gone for their entire childhoods. The physical and psychological damage from years in the camps made reintegration difficult. Many women suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, plagued by nightmares, unable to adjust to normal life, their health permanently compromised by years of malnutrition and overwork. Yet, despite everything, many of these women rebuilt their lives with remarkable resilience. They found work, remarried or reunited with families, and gradually created new normals for themselves. Most chose not to speak about their experiences, the memories too painful, the reception too cold. It was only decades later, as historians began to take interest in these forgotten stories, that some survivors agreed to give interviews, to write memoirs, to testify about what they had endured. Their accounts, when they finally emerged, painted a picture of suffering that rivaled any endured during the war. Yet their story remained largely unknown outside of academic circles. The fate of male POWs in Soviet camps received more attention. The death marches and concentration camps of the Holocaust understandably dominated discussions of wartime atrocity, and the suffering of women in Soviet labor camps was relegated to a footnote.
This historical amnesia is particularly striking given the scale of what occurred. The Soviet camp system during and after the war held millions of prisoners, a significant portion of whom were women. While male prisoners of war from Germany numbered in the millions, the women, though fewer in number, faced particular vulnerabilities. They were subject to sexual violence and exploitation in ways that male prisoners were not.
Camp guards and officials who would not have dared to abuse male prisoners felt free to assault women with little fear of consequences. Sexual violence in the camps was endemic and took many forms. Guards would demand sexual favors in exchange for food, medicine, or easier work assignments. Women who refused faced retaliation, reduced rations, assignment to the worst work details. Some women formed relationships with guards or male prisoners as a survival strategy, trading intimacy for protection or resources. Others were simply raped, the violence brutal and indifferent. Pregnancy in the camps was a death sentence for the child, and often for the mother as well. There were no facilities for childbirth, no care for infants, no mercy in a system that valued only labor output. The camp administrators maintained a fiction of legal propriety, with rules against fraternization and official channels for reporting abuse, but these mechanisms were meaningless in practice. A woman who reported rape faced retaliation not only from her attacker, but from the camp administration, which saw such complaints as troublemaking. Better to suffer in silence, to accept the abuse as one more indignity in a litany of horrors. Some women found unexpected sources of solidarity. Soviet political prisoners, women who had been arrested as enemies of the people during Stalin's purges, sometimes formed alliances with the foreign prisoners of war. These Soviet women, often educated and from urban backgrounds, had learned to navigate the camp system's brutal realities. They shared survival strategies, offered protection when they could, and provided a bridge across the language and cultural barriers. Not all such relationships were positive. Some Soviet prisoners harbored deep resentment against Germans and their allies, blaming them for the invasion that had devastated their country. But many recognized that all prisoners, regardless of nationality, were victims of the same merciless system. The cultural and language barriers presented their own challenges. A woman who spoke only Hungarian or Romanian in a camp population of Russians, Germans, and various other nationalities lived in a particularly isolating hell. Simple communications became impossible. Understanding camp rules, work assignments, or changes in routine required either learning Russian quickly or finding a translator, and the latter option created dependencies that could be exploited. Yet language also became a form of resistance. Women taught each other words and phrases from their languages, creating a polyglot camp vocabulary that excluded the guards. They sang songs in their native tongues, whispered prayers in languages the authorities did not understand, and maintained linguistic connections to their identities and homelands. A German woman might teach others a folk song from her village. A Hungarian might recite poetry she had memorized in school. These small acts of cultural preservation became acts of defiance against a system designed to erase individual identity. The changing seasons brought their own rhythms to camp life, though none of the changes brought relief. Spring meant the melting of snow and the transformation of camps into seas of mud. The ground, frozen solid all winter, turned into a quagmire that sucked at boots and made every step exhausting. But spring also meant slightly longer days, and the faint hope that came with the end of winter's worst cold. Summer brought warmth, but also mosquitoes in biblical swarms, particularly in the northern camps near swamps and rivers. The insects were so thick that women would wrap their heads in cloth, leaving only slits for eyes, and still be covered in bites that swelled and became infected. Autumn was perhaps the most bearable season, with moderate temperatures and the insects dying off. But autumn also meant the approach of winter and the dread that came with knowing another season of cold was coming. The first snowfall brought a particular despair, the realization that they had survived another year, but were still prisoners, still trapped in this frozen hell. Winter itself was the great killer. The temperatures in Siberian camps could drop to 40 or 50 degrees below zero, cold beyond what most Europeans had ever experienced. At such temperatures, exposed skin freezes in minutes, breath freezes in the air. Metal tools become so cold they can freeze to bare hands. The camp authorities made minimal concessions to the weather. Work quotas were sometimes reduced, outdoor work might be suspended on the very coldest days, but generally the expectation was that prisoners would continue working regardless of conditions.
The winter clothing issued to prisoners was inadequate.
A padded jacket and trousers provided some insulation, but not enough. Women wrapped their feet in rags before putting on the felt boots, hoping the extra layers would prevent frostbite. They covered their faces with scarves, leaving only their eyes exposed. But still the cold found its way through every gap, every weak point. Fingers and toes went numb, then painful, then numb again as frostbite set in. In the barracks at night, women would check each other's extremities, looking for the telltale white patches that indicated frozen flesh. Medical amputations in the camps were crude affairs. A camp doctor, working with limited anesthesia and primitive tools, would remove blackened fingers or toes that had died from frostbite. The survivors were then expected to return to work as soon as possible, learning to function with fewer digits, their ability to work diminished, but their quotas unchanged. The question of collaboration haunted the camps, as it haunted all prisoner of war experiences. Some women chose to cooperate with camp authorities, working as informers or taking on supervisory roles over other prisoners. These women, called trustees, received better rations, lighter work assignments, and warmer quarters in exchange for their collaboration. They might report on conversations overheard in the barracks, identify prisoners who were hoarding extra food or conducting unauthorized trade, or simply maintain order among their fellow prisoners. The moral calculus of collaboration was complex. Was it wrong to accept a position in the camp administration if it meant survival? Was informing on a fellow prisoner inexcusable under any circumstances? These were not hypothetical questions, but daily dilemmas faced by women who were starving, exhausted, and desperate. Most prisoners held collaborators in contempt, yet many also understood the pressures that led to such choices. In a system designed to pit prisoners against each other, maintaining solidarity was an act of resistance, but perfect solidarity was impossible. Yet there were also women who refused any compromise, who maintained their principles even at great personal cost. They shared their rations with the weak, refused to inform on fellow prisoners, and accepted punishment rather than cooperate. These women became moral anchors for their barracks, living examples that human decency could survive even in the camps. Their presence reminded others that they were not merely animals fighting for survival, but human beings capable of choice and dignity. Acts of resistance in the camps were necessarily small and covert. Overt rebellion was impossible and would have been suicidal. Guards had orders to shoot anyone attempting to escape or refusing direct orders. But there were subtle forms of resistance, working slowly, sabotaging equipment accidentally, spreading news and rumors, maintaining cultural and religious practices. These small acts did not change the fundamental reality of captivity, but they provided psychological sustenance, a reminder that the prisoners retained some agency, however limited. There were occasional work slowdowns, where an entire brigade would tacitly agree to reduce their output. Such actions were risky because they resulted in reduced rations for all involved, but they also demonstrated that collective action was possible and that the camp authorities were not omnipotent. More commonly, resistance took the form of mutual aid, sharing resources, protecting the weak, maintaining human connections in an environment designed to isolate and dehumanize. The role of luck and chance in survival cannot be overstated. A woman assigned to work in the camp kitchen had access to extra food scraps and warmth from the stoves. A woman with typing skills might be pulled from hard labor to work in the camp office. A woman who happened to fall ill on the day her brigade was sent to the worst worksite might survive where others died. Conversely, bad luck could be fatal. Being assigned to a particularly brutal guard, contracting typhus, suffering a work accident. The survivors recognized that their survival was not purely a matter of strength or will, but also of circumstances beyond their control. As the years passed and some prisoners began to be released, those who remained found the weight almost unbearable. Every few months a list of names would be posted, prisoners who were being repatriated. The lottery of selection seemed arbitrary. Why was one woman chosen for release while another, captured on the same day and convicted of the same offense, remained? The Soviet authorities offered no explanations. Women whose names appeared on the lists had a few days to prepare, though preparation meant little when one owned nothing but the clothes issued by the camp. The The journey home was almost as difficult as the journey to the camps had been. Again, the freight trains, again, the weeks of travel across the vastness of the Soviet Union. But this time, the destination was freedom, and that hope sustained the women through another ordeal of transport. They were processed through transit camps on the Soviet borders, where they were photographed, documented, and searched one final time. Then they crossed into Poland or East Germany or whatever country was to receive them, and the camps finally fell behind them.
The physical transformation wrought by years in the camps was shocking. Women who had entered captivity in their 20s looked 50. Their teeth were gone from scurvy, their hair prematurely gray, their bodies wizened by malnutrition. Many had permanent health damage, lungs destroyed by dust and cold, hearts weakened by years of strain, limbs that had been broken and set improperly. They would live with these injuries for the rest of their lives, permanent reminders of what they had endured. The psychological scars were equally profound. Survivors described feeling disconnected from the world they returned to, unable to relate to people who had not shared their experiences. Normal concerns seemed trivial after years of fighting for survival. Food had a particular significance. Many survivors hoarded food compulsively, unable to break the habits learned in the camps. Others could never feel truly warm again, always keeping their homes overheated, always wearing layers of clothing even in summer. Sleep was difficult, interrupted by nightmares of the camps. Loud noises provoked panic attacks. The sight of police or officials triggered visceral fear reactions. These were not weaknesses, but natural responses to trauma. Though in the 1950s, when these women were returning, there was little understanding or treatment for what they had experienced. They were expected to simply move on, to be grateful for their survival, to not burden others with their stories. Some survivors channeled their experiences into activism or testimony, determined that their suffering should not be forgotten. They spoke at historical conferences, contributed to archives, wrote memoirs. These women fought against the tendency to forget, to minimize, to treat the camps as just another unfortunate aspect of the war. Their testimony has been invaluable to historians trying to piece together what happened in those years. Others chose silence, finding it too painful to revisit their experiences, or finding that no one wanted to hear what they had to say. In post-war Germany and other European countries, there was a general desire to move forward, to rebuild, to not dwell on uncomfortable truths. The suffering of German prisoners in Soviet camps was a particularly sensitive topic during the Cold War, easily exploited for propaganda purposes by both sides, and therefore something many preferred not to discuss at all. The passage of time has finally allowed a more balanced historical assessment. We can acknowledge that these women suffered terribly without minimizing the suffering of others, without engaging in competitive victimhood, without losing sight of the larger context of the war. The women prisoners in Soviet camps were victims of a brutal system, but they were also part of a larger catastrophe that engulfed all of Europe and much of the world. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 had unleashed a war of unprecedented savagery. Nazi ideology regarded Slavic peoples as inferior, Soviet territory as living space to be colonized by Germans, and Soviet prisoners and civilians as expendable labor or useless mouths to be eliminated. German forces and their allies committed atrocities on a massive scale, shooting civilians, starving prisoners, burning villages, operating death camps. The Soviet response, when the tide turned and the Red Army pushed westward, included its own wave of violence and vengeance. The treatment of prisoners, the mass expulsions, the casual brutality were in part retribution for what had been done to Soviet territory and people. This context does not excuse the suffering inflicted on women in the labor camps, but it helps explain the mindset of Soviet authorities who saw all Germans and their allies as collectively guilty, who regarded the provision of minimal food and shelter to prisoners as generous given what German forces had done to Soviet prisoners and civilians. The Soviet people had suffered catastrophically, 27 million dead, entire cities destroyed, vast swaths of territory devastated. In that context, the suffering of enemy prisoners ranked very low on any scale of moral concern.
Yet, even acknowledging this context, the treatment of women prisoners violated basic standards of humanity. The Geneva Conventions, which the Soviets had not signed, but which represented international consensus on the treatment of prisoners, required that POWs be fed adequately, housed safely, and not subjected to dangerous labor or exploitation. The Soviet treatment of prisoners fell short of these standards, and the particular vulnerabilities of women prisoners to sexual violence, to the physical demands of heavy labor, for which they were often less suited than men, to the lack of appropriate medical care for women's health issues, made their situation especially dire. The question of justice for what these women endured has no satisfactory answer. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991 without ever acknowledging wrongdoing or offering compensation to its former prisoners. Russia, as the Soviet Union's successor state, has taken no responsibility for Soviet-era crimes. The women who survived received no reparations, no official apology, no formal recognition of their suffering. Most died in obscurity, their stories known only to their families and a few dedicated historians.
In recent decades, there have been efforts to document and commemorate these experiences. Memorial organizations in Germany and other countries have collected testimonies from survivors and their families. Archives in Russia have slowly opened, allowing historians access to camp records and documents. Museums have created exhibits, books have been written. But these efforts reach limited audiences and have not fundamentally changed the place of this history in popular memory. The story of women in Soviet labor camps challenges our narratives about World War II in several ways. It complicates the simple story of Allied virtue against Axis evil by showing that the Allied powers, specifically the Soviet Union, committed serious atrocities against prisoners. It highlights the particular vulnerabilities of women in wartime and captivity. It demonstrates that suffering did not end with the war's official conclusion, but continued for years afterward. And it reminds us that historical memory is selective, that some stories are told repeatedly while others are forgotten. These women deserve to be remembered not as abstract statistics, but as individuals who endured and, in many cases, survived experiences that would have broken anyone. They showed remarkable resilience, finding ways to maintain their humanity in conditions designed to destroy it. They supported each other, shared what little they had, kept alive hope and culture and identity when everything conspired to erase these things. Their survival, in many cases, was not a triumph but simply an endurance, a grim continuation marked by permanent physical and psychological damage. Yet even that endurance has meaning. They outlasted the camps, outlasted Stalin, outlasted the Soviet Union itself. They returned to tell their stories, or at least some of them did, and their testimony survives as a warning about what humans can inflict on other humans and what humans can somehow survive. In the vast and terrible catalog of 20th century atrocities, the suffering of women in Soviet labor camps occupies a particular and painful place. It was suffering on a mass scale, inflicted systematically over years, and yet it remains largely unknown. This is history's final injustice to these women, that their suffering has been forgotten or minimized, deemed less important than other stories, swept aside in narratives that have no room for their experiences. But their stories persist, passed down through families, preserved in archives, slowly being recovered by historians committed to telling the whole truth about the war and its aftermath. These stories deserve to be heard, not to assign blame or perpetuate old enmities, but simply because they are true, because these women lived and suffered and deserve to be remembered. In remembering them, we acknowledge the full human cost of war, not just the soldiers who died on battlefields, but the countless civilians and prisoners who suffered in labor camps, displaced persons camps, ruined cities and occupied territories. The wind still blows across the Siberian wastes where the camps once stood. Most of the camps have been dismantled, their wooden buildings rotted away or torn down, their barbed wire rusted and gone. Nature has reclaimed the sites, trees growing where barracks once stood, grass covering the mass graves. A few camps have been preserved as museums, their buildings maintained as monuments to what occurred there, but most have vanished as if they never existed. Yet they did exist, and thousands of women passed through them, and their experiences shaped the rest of their lives and the lives of their descendants. In their survival and their testimony, they left us a legacy, a reminder of human cruelty and human endurance, of systems designed to break the spirit and individuals who somehow maintained their dignity despite everything. Their story is one chapter in the vast, terrible history of the 20th century, a century that saw more organized violence and suffering than perhaps any before it. But it is also a story of individual human beings facing impossible circumstances, making choices large and small, surviving or not surviving, and in some cases finding the strength to tell the world what they endured. In their voices, in their memories, in the records they left behind, these women speak to us still, demanding that we remember, that we acknowledge, that we never forget what can happen when human beings treat other human beings not as fellow creatures deserving of dignity, but as mere tools, expendable resources in service of ideological abstractions. The cold that these women endured was not just physical, but existential, a coldness that came from being forgotten by the world, treated as less than human, denied basic compassion and care. Against that cold, they found warmth in solidarity with fellow prisoners, in memories of home and family, in stubborn hope that they would survive to see freedom again. Not all did survive, and even those who did bore permanent scars. But they endured, and in their endurance, they proved that the human spirit, however battered and diminished, can survive even in the coldest, darkest places.